The Master of Science in Operations Management program is proud to introduce Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas for his presentation on Dr. Rich Ham's Special Topics course, Resilient Design and Crisis Management. We begin this online presentation with Governor Hutchinson speaking about his professional experience. All parties have agreed to be recorded.
I've been blessed in life with having a lot of opportunities. I'm a lawyer by profession. I have practiced law for many years. I was United States Attorney, as was mentioned, and sometimes excitement or challenges follow me. When I was U.S. Attorney, I was called upon to assist in the negotiation of a terrorist group, working with a hostage rescue team. So that was crisis management at a different level. And then I went to Congress and life was back to normal. President Bush asked me to head up the DEA, which was an operational challenge, but it was policy, it was operations. I go over there, and that is 1 month before the 9/11 attack occurred. And the president then asked me, well, of course, that was crisis management on that particular day because we were part of the response team of the Department of Justice. And then he asked me to go over and help set up the new Department of Homeland Security. And I'll tell you a couple of stories because from my perspective, I'm not necessarily the operational commander at the response level. I am a little bit higher in terms of policy and operations, but it comes down to leadership and how you follow procedures to manage through a crisis. And so my first day at Homeland Security, I'm undersecretary. I have 110,000 people reporting to me. You don't know what's coming on that first day. And while I'm in there, the operations chief comes to me and says, Mr. Secretary, we have a plane that's been hijacked from Cuba. It's headed toward the airspace of the United States. What action should we take? Well, I've been in Congress, I'm head of the DEA, I'm a lawyer. How in the world should I know how we should respond whenever we've got a hijacked plane headed toward the airspace of the United States? And of course, you lead by asking the right questions, by having a good team in place, understanding what the protocols are, working your way through that crisis that you've never had to deal with before. That kind of circumstance followed me day in and day out during my 2 years at Homeland Security, from the challenges of terrorists abroad to our airlines and the threats to them. That's some of the experience that I had in my background through Homeland Security. And then I come and I get elected governor of Arkansas, and I'm working on job creation. I'm working on computer science initiatives. I'm working on public safety. And I go through my first term, a great success in terms of low unemployment rate that is historic. Jobs are created. We're leading the nation in computer science education, and everything's going great in my second term until March 11 of this year, and a pandemic hits the United States of America. We know it's coming here to Arkansas. And I'll precede that by saying I've had to deal with emergencies before as governor. We have a good emergency response system through our ATOM. AJ Gary does a great job. We've dealt with tornadoes, but tornadoes, they come and they do their damage, and then you respond to them. And we understand those systems, the partnership with our local emergency responders. Last year, we had the historic flood. That was new. I'll never forget the day that the Army Corps of Engineers from Oklahoma, the commander called me, and I'm looking out at a bright, sunshiny day, not a cloud in the sky in Arkansas. And the commander of the Corps of Engineers says that they've had enormous rainfall in Oklahoma. They're going to have to release the floodgates. And he said, you can expect floods that you've never seen before. You need to prepare to evacuate. I look out at the sky and I don't see a cloud. It's hard to imagine a flood, but that's what comes. And that was unusual because we actually had time to prepare for it. But we felt, the challenge of that disaster. And then again, come forward to this year with seeing what happened in Washington State, starting in New York. You know it's coming your direction, the virus, and it hit us on March 11th. I immediately issued my emergency declaration. We set in motion our medical health team to give me counsel and advice. I'm brought up to speed on all the pandemic exercises and protocols that we implement. We coordinate with the White House and the FEMA at the national level, and we start responding to this. And it's, you've seen it because you've lived through the last 7 months and we're still in the middle of it. So I just wanted to relate a few of the decision points that I've had to deal with that were significantly challenging. The first one was, you'll remember back last March and April, where the national media, the national pressure of every state needed to shut down, they needed to shelter in place, they needed to stop economic activity and not do anything. And I talked to Dr. Nate Smith, then our Secretary of Health, and we looked at our team and we said, that's not going to make the difference that they expect, and it's going to cause hundreds of thousands of people in Arkansas to be without a job. And only the governor can make the decision at that point. And I had to defend my decision on national television time and time again that no, we're not sheltering in place. Yes, we are only one of 5 states that haven't done that. It doesn't make sense for Arkansas. I'm not going to put 100,000 people out of a job without it making sense in terms of having a benefit from a public health standpoint. That was the first difficult decision we made. I still believe it is the right decision. History is going to judge that, but every state that sheltered in place is no longer sheltering in place, and the cases are still coming up in their state. And so you've got to manage your way through that, and that's the decision and the best judgment that I could make, is that you can't stop economic activity. You can have a targeted approach where those face-to-face businesses, we put more controls there, but we've got to keep moving. And that led to the second big decision, which was a mask mandate. Everybody knows in Arkansas that was not a popular decision, but that was the only tool that we had to work with to make sure that we can have economic activity. How can you go to work? How can you carry out businesses? How can you do these things unless you have that protection of social distancing and the mask? We put that into a mandate. I will stand by that decision, and I think that is one tool that is proving somewhat successful. The third big decision was, what do we do about school this year? And there was enormous pressure to go totally virtual, not to have in-classroom instruction. And I knew the harm that would do to the students if we did not have the option for in-classroom instruction. I also knew the challenge it was for the teachers and the health risk that they were concerned with. Only the governor can make that decision. And I made the decision that we needed to have 2 options this year. One was every parent should have the option, if they decided to do all virtual, they could do all virtual. But we would give every school had to have the option of in-classroom instruction. And time will tell, but I know that the educators are saying it makes all the difference for the children in their education to have that option of in-classroom instruction. So that's an ongoing challenge. Whenever you look at some of how we've coordinated and worked together, the states have never had such a leadership role in a national emergency such as this. Part of it is because of the nature of a pandemic, that these decisions are best made at the local level. Part of it is that the White House defined their role as supporting the states, giving them flexibility and decision making, but also to support them in the acquisition of PPE, to help us in our testing, to provide us with financial resources that have made an enormous difference. Arkansas got $1.25 billion from the federal government to help manage the pandemic. We've utilized that for our schools and extra compensation for the medical personnel. We've used it for building the infrastructure of testing and contact tracing. We've used it to support PPE acquisition for our emergency managers, as well as for our schools and our hospitals. And so that money has been very helpful to us, in addition to trying to provide some economic assistance to struggling businesses because of government restrictions. But that has been a unique federal-state partnership that has got some criticism. I've got my own criticism of parts of it, but it has given the states flexibility and a key leadership role. The same thing is going to be true when we acquire the vaccine. When it's developed, the states will have a key leadership role in making sure that the vaccines are distributed fairly, have a defined approach as to who has priority. We'll be coordinating, of course, with CDC and the White House Coronavirus Task Force as well. So those are just a couple of the issues that we faced. Let me look to the future for a second. And one, I'm very anxious, of course, to get this pandemic over with, to have the vaccine in place. And I'm also anxious for that post bipartisan review of the decisions that have been made by governors and by the decision makers in Washington, D.C. A lot of people get nervous about those kind of congressional reviews or national reviews because it's going to cast judgment on the decisions that have been made. But I believe it's incredibly important, just like the 9/11 Commission that made findings after our 9/11 attack and how we responded to that and how we need to improve our systems, make them more protective, resilient, and to plan for the future. That's really what led to the formation of the Department of Homeland Security. So it reformed our response capability and our Homeland Security efforts. We're going to have the same kind of review when this is over with. I hope everybody reads it. You might be writing books on that, but it'll help us to know what to do in the next pandemic. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges is in our acquisition of personal protective equipment. We didn't have enough of. The states were competing with each other. I never thought as governor that I would be sending tens of millions of dollars over to China and having to buy time on a factory floor in China to manufacture N95 masks for our healthcare providers in Arkansas, to at the last minute to be outbid by New York, where they bought even more production time than we did with a premium. That is what I found myself in. It is not a very comfortable position. We had one order from Europe that was designed for Arkansas. We paid money for it. It's coming through Spain. Spain at that time tremendously needed as their national response effort PPE. So what did they do? They found out Arkansas had shipment going through Spain, and they overrode our acquisition of it, and they took possession of it and dispersed it. We never got it. So those are challenges that governors should never have to face during a pandemic. And so we look to the future when this is over with. In fact, we're already making plans to have a FEMA type approach to our state stockpile of ventilators, personal protective equipment. We want to have contracts in place. We want to have an inventory management system in which we don't want to open up it someday and find out that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but the equipment has expired in terms of its useful life. So you've got to have an ongoing management of that stockpile. We're already starting to do that planning for the future. So we need you. Get your degrees. There's going to be plenty of opportunity to engage nationally and at the state level in resilience and design and in response and recovery. So with that, I'm delighted to make these comments today, and I'll look forward to having questions from everyone.
Thank you very much, Governor. As a moderator, I'll take liberty to ask one thing, and you mentioned it, and I think it's something that our students need to hear. We go at lengths to bring in people with a lot of real world experience. We teach, we have some world-class decision scientists and individuals that can teach techniques. But in the end, you made the comment that it's the governor that had to make this decision. Tell us a little bit on how the process that you use as a leader when you're presented with science, and in the one case you have somebody that's looking at, hey, I need to, we need to lock everything down. The other's telling you the economic impact. What's the process that you go through to come up with kind of a final solution?
Well, first of all, you have to be a very good listener, and you have to be able to ask the right questions. And you have to put the right teams together. For example, we have a team within the Department of Health of incredible epidemiologists, of healthcare professionals, academics that understand pandemics and disease control. They're making sets of recommendation. Now, obviously, if you're looking at how to control the virus, you control it best by shutting everything down, everybody mandated to stay in your own home, nobody going to business, cutting the travel down, and shutting our economy down. That is the easiest way to minimize risk. Those are the kind of recommendations that would come from that side of the coin. But there's another side of that, which is the economic consequences. And is there a way to moderate the risk, reduce the risk, but in order to be able to keep moving and not to have a massive depression? And so I have to achieve that balance. And so I create an economic recovery task force. I have the voice of the economy expressed in the debate within the medical health professionals. So I have to bring that balance to the discussion so that they can listen to each other. And in the end, you hope that there will be a consensus of a decision. And then it comes to me. And, there's been a couple of good debates in which, it's been a 5-4, or there's been 5 that recommended one particular direction. You had 4 dissenters. And, it's tossed in my lap. And I appreciate them because they understand that I'm ultimately having to make those decisions. When it came to sports, it was a very similar situation. The easy call from the epidemiologist is, of course, we do not want any type of football this year. We don't want to have stands out or fans in the stands. But I knew that and I heard from students, I heard from teachers, I heard from parents, there's another side to that coin. So I put together a sports advisory group that was comprised of epidemiologists as well as parents and sports experts coming together, and they had a discussion, and they were able to make recommendations to me that were much different. So I see that as my job, is bringing that balance into the discussion. In terms of decision making, it's particularly when you're dealing with issues like this, you've got to make a decision. The worst thing that can happen is that you dither, and you can't make a decision. A bad decision today, or a decision that has some information today, could be better than a decision 2 weeks from now with all the information you want. And so you've got to time those decisions. Sometimes you have to act on imperfect information, and but the timeliness of those decisions is critical.
Well, thank you, sir. That exactly the kind of things we're trying to teach. What I'd like to do is to open it up for questions, and if what we can get is if you will put your question in the chat box, we will monitor that so that it's orderly. So anybody that has a question, please put it into chat. I'm not seeing anything yet. Oh, here we go. Governor, this is from Justin. Justin, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Justin, you should be able to unmute.
Oh, thank you. I think I got it now. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. Our power recently went out, so we're doing a little resilience management ourselves here. So thank you, Governor, for being here. Really interesting comments there to kick us off. I'm curious, you mentioned how the state is going to try and build a supply and an inventory management system around these critical supplies. I'm curious, what are some ways that you see the federal and state governments collaborating with the private sector on supply of inventory and also factory capacity if this were to ever happen again?
Well, one of the tools that FEMA use is that they have contingent contracts. So they don't have to buy everything in advance and manage the inventory, but they will have a contract and they have to pay a premium for it with a supplier that they will come in on quick notice, quick response, and be ready with the supply or with the service. And so they have pre-positioned and advanced contracts on a whole host of needs that might be needed, whether it's a hurricane, tornado, debris cleanup, or flooding. And so I understood that model. And so I look at the future and I ask the question, can we have a similar type of contingent contract where we don't have to maintain all of the PPE every day, but that we have a committed supply chain in the event it needs to be triggered, and we'd pay a premium for that, of course, but that is a partnership with the private sector. And then in addition, we're actually negotiating right now with a management team, a supply management team that will have a supply in our state warehouse, and they will manage it in terms of their expiration dates, how they need to replenish it, how they need to keep it fresh and at the right level. And so we're already proceeding with that private sector contract. There's things that it makes so much more sense to utilize the private sector because they can be more flexible. They can be more creative, innovative than sometimes the government can. It gives us flexibility if we can manage it through the private sector response. So good question, Justin.
Our next one is from Jack Hutchinson. Jack, you should be unmuted or able to unmute yourself.
Hey, so I was wondering, once a vaccine is made readily available to the public, how long do you think it'll take for the state to recover economically?
Great question, Jack, and it's good to hear from you. In terms of the vaccine, once it is approved by FDA and all of the regulators, then it's got to be produced. It's got to be distributed. And of course, we're working in advance on all of those, part of Operation Warp Speed. But, the best projections is, it's going to be into next spring before it really starts getting out widely in the states. Of course, medical health professionals will be first. Our most vulnerable populations, probably education will be a part of that mix. And then we'll get it out more broadly. And we've got to have confidence in that. And that's a very important part of it. We want to build confidence and not undermine the approval process of the FDA. So when the vaccine comes out, we have to have, more than 50% or 60% of the population getting vaccinated before it is successful and before you have that immunity. So we've got to build that confidence, a lot of work to be done. And then the question is, how about the economy? The economy is just rip-roaring, ready to come back, but we have some restrictions we cannot lift. For example, restaurants are still struggling. We have them at 2/3 capacity. Some are thriving in that environment because they've adjusted their model where they can have drive-through and carry out things like that. Others, though, do not have that kind of space, and so they're struggling financially, and I'm worried about losing some of those. But I can't open it up to full capacity whenever we have cases at this level. So they're going to take some time to come back, but they're ready to go. The hospitality industry, including hotel lodging, that's not going to come back fully until we open up and we stop doing Zoom meetings and we actually have in-person meetings again. And then people travel, people will be in our business clientele will be in the lodging. So there's just certain segments going to take a while to come back. In Arkansas, I've got industries that are ready to announce that they're coming to Arkansas, hiring people again, but they can't travel during the pandemic. They still have restrictions. And so it's slowed that pipeline of new jobs being created. So it's going to be into mid next year before we see a real complete recovery and what I would see as the next boom ahead of us.
Okay, Governor, our next question's from Jerry Cruz. Jerry, you're unmuted.
Yes, I just wanted to shift back to, since I'm a student, with a question about virtual learning. Do you see the possibility of this being a permanent solution, like being able to have the option of virtual learning from now on for all students? Because the faculty and staff and everybody's jumped through the hoops and learned how to do it. Do you think it will be a possible thing forever? And if not, when do you think we'll have to have mandatory face-to-face classes?
Well, let's divide it. First, in K-12, the preference, I think, during that age group will always be in classroom instruction. But we'll also, I think, have more flexibility, which we've got to adjust our rules. Under the law, we have mandatory attendance requirements that is in classroom instruction. Under my emergency power, I have said we can do it virtual and it can meet that requirement. So I really waive the requirement of the law. So if we're going to have any aspect of virtual, we've got to adjust that from a legal standpoint to give attendance days. I think that will be a minority, but there's some instruction that it could happen. I think it will increase the appetite for some people for virtual learning, a virtual academy. The charter schools who will be offering more virtual learning as an option. In terms of our college atmosphere, I think you'll see a more significant adjustment in class structure. In classroom instruction, and that person-to-person time with the instructor will always be the premium and the highest quality. But I think you will see more flexibility in terms of utilizing virtual. And, in fact, we have the e-university, the online university,
Yeah.
the University of Arkansas. That's going to blossom, because it will be an option that more people consider more broadly. and what's got to accompany that is that the higher education also has to rethink the necessity of more and more buildings. If you're going to increase virtual learning, then you need to decrease the investment in capital and new buildings and new buildings and new buildings. So you've got to adjust the cost model as well to make it cost effective.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Governor, our next question is from Greg Parnell. Dr. Parnell, you should be unmuted.
Okay. Thank you, Governor, for speaking in the course. In this particular epidemic, a great amount has been said about scientists and their role and how government leaders should trust scientists. But scientists all have different, in this pandemic, they all have different levels of knowledge and information, and they disagreed. And then we even saw scientists rapidly changing their opinions as they received new information. So how hard is, as an executive, how hard is that to deal with and sort out when scientists disagree or continually change their opinions and recommendations?
Well, it's difficult, and I'll say this here, but you know, CDC has been a good partner. They've been consistent in their messaging. The White House Coronavirus Task Force has been consistent in their messaging in terms of the importance of mask wearing, in terms of social distancing and what we need to do. Now, that's been countermanded for a while by some of the other national messaging that you've heard and the politicization of it. So if you're going to have a national emergency or a pandemic specifically, don't have it during an election year. It just adds a level of difficulty, even in Arkansas. I mean, the debate over the measures that we need to take and the difference of political opinion on it has been very frustrating. But even, you know, as a policymaker, I recognize that the epidemiologists know more about coronavirus now than they did 7 months ago, and some of the guidance has changed. That is understandable to me, and I'm not frustrated by that. But for example, you'll remember that CDC changed their guidelines, and I was trying to think what it was. It was on contact tracing, and I immediately knew that didn't make sense. And I said, we're not following the CDC guidelines. And sure enough, a week later, they reversed their guidelines again. And so there's been a little bit of frustration on that. And ultimately, I've just treated them as guidelines. I mean, I get the guidance from a whole bunch of different health professionals, and you listen to it, you try to sort through it, and you never and you give credence to it. And so my rule is to follow it, but when there's inconsistent guidance, you make the best judgment that you can. But it makes it difficult for the public to understand a consistent responsibility that they have in responding to it.
Thank you.
Governor, our next question is from Brian Gallagher. Brian, you should be unmuted.
Brian, I think you've got, there you go.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is very enlightening. Really appreciate your insights. I'm curious about, you know, we think about floods and tornadoes in this area. They happen all the time. We can plan for those. A pandemic isn't something that, you know, we would think of would have a high probability of happening, but it does have a large impact. I'm curious as to what other types of scenarios does your team look at, and what are you concerned about that maybe lower probability of occurrence but high impact that you're thinking about, that you're worried about, that you plan for, and then how do you decide whether to take some kind of mitigation action or not based on that scenario?
Probably the best example is the flooding that we've had. We've had periodic flooding every other year, probably since I've been governor, that has led to significant damage and national disaster declarations. Last year was the worst with the historic 100-year flood of the Arkansas River. And you should be aware that when that happened, we responded to it, but we also initiated better processes for the future. We made some investments for the future that hopefully will make a difference. I set up my levy task force that had the Corps of Engineers, county judges, emergency managers, local officials, all on that levy task force that made some recommendations. We had some law changes that were made that helps us to reconstruct and reform some of our levy, local levy boards that's responsible for maintaining the levies. We put money into this to help repair it. And so we have really taken those type of initiatives for what has become more routine in Arkansas, and that is the flooding. We're adequately prepared for tornadoes and windstorm. I mean, it's always, but we're challenging, but we're very experienced in that. One thing, when you look at the future, when I was at Homeland Security, there were 3 great threats to America that all the planners worried about. One was the Katrina type hurricane in New Orleans and the breaking of the levees there. The second one was the California earthquakes, San Andreas fault. The third national emergency that the planners were most concerned about was the New Madrid fault and the New Madrid earthquake potential that would occur in Arkansas. And so, we do exercises for an earthquake drill. And that has to be in part of the planning for anybody who's governor of Arkansas or Missouri or Tennessee in that area, because that is a national concern that would impact Arkansas. I want to mention one thing. It's in your questions that I'm going to jump ahead to it. But about crisis management system and how it's performing, I wanted to make a point here that we have a very good crisis management system that is set out by executive order that is mirrored in the states, that is the incident management system that we're trained on. It is a very, very good system that we have. But systems break down based upon inexperience or the inability to properly execute on that incident management system. And Katrina is a good example of that. There was a change in leadership at Homeland Security pre-Katrina. And so you had a new leadership team that came in, and you had some inexperience in Louisiana that was probably a little bit fearful about making tough decisions. And so the incident management system was in place, but it was not executed properly. And we saw that in Katrina, and that's what you've got to guard against. It's a matter of a new governor coming in, and my counsel to them is the most important 3 people in your cabinet is the Adjutant General of the National Guard that responds to emergencies. It is your ADAM Director, Emergency Management Director. And then thirdly, it is the Commander of the Arkansas State Police. Those are your 3 tools to respond to an emergency. They've got to function very well together in an emergency. And so it's about execution and knowing how to set that up. We train on that, and it's got to be done every year.
Governor, those are the only ones we have in the queue. We're coming up on the time, and we certainly appreciate the time that you've given us tonight. But one quick thing, the last one I'd ask you is, this class does all the EMI 100, 200C, and 700 that through FEMA about the use of NIMS and the application, and then how to design systems. But in this pandemic, one of the things often that's looked at is where the request for help comes from, and then going from local to county, county to state, state sometimes to a compact between states, and then federal. Could you talk just a minute about how challenging that was when those steps are always, they kind of assume that you're going to have a regional issue that you can get help from, but then when it affects the entire nation at one time, the kind of things, at least in the system, that made it challenging.
Well, and I'll respond to that, and you can follow up if I don't answer it directly or I miss the point. But the first challenge was that our Department of Emergency Management is used to probably dealing with the local emergency managers in response to a tornado or flood damage. I mean, that coordination has been real smooth. This was a little bit different, a pandemic, because you have the Emergency Operations Center, but the Department of Health is the lead agency in responding to the pandemic. And so there was a real division of authority that we managed very well. It was a great partnership, but it was the procurement of PPE, the coordination with FEMA, that we utilized our typical emergency management operations center to accomplish that. And it was the Department of Health that took on the local response on contact tracing and all the local issues that we dealt with COVID-19. In terms of FEMA, that got a little convoluted because, and it was very frustrating because, I've talked to the White House Coronavirus Task Force, and they would say, FEMA has all of these resources and they're going to be distributing to them. And it's not just on PPE, but it was also on testing equipment. Well, FEMA was not the one to go to on testing equipment. They might put a request in the supply chain, but we had to fight ourselves because the federal government was telling FEMA, don't send it to Arkansas, send all of this testing equipment to California or New Orleans where the hot spots are, because there's a limited supply. And so that supply chain was broken down, which made us as a state go outside of that normal supply chain and try to find directly from the private sector, where can we get equipment? Where can we get the testing equipment and the supplies and the reagents that we need and the PPE? So, we were fighting on our own. And then it was a little disjointed also because when the federal government did get the supplies, they didn't send them directly to the state. They would send them directly to the hospitals, and they would give us an inventory list as who is getting what. And so there was a lot of, I think that could be done probably better because, we have a supply that's built up with the state that we're trying to coordinate with our local hospitals. Well, they have their separate supply coming in from the private sector and coming in directly from the federal government. So follow up if you want, Rich, to see if there's a follow-up question.
Well, no, I think that's I think it's fantastic for students in particular. You answered it exactly. It's a lot bigger, and you're trying to take 4 or 5 different systems that are doing parallel functions and make them work together. And this is the only time they ever have to do that. We did have one last one from Marty Matlock, and this will have to be the last one for everybody because we're right up at our time. So Marty, you're, I think, unmuted.
Thank you, Rich. Not my dog. That's my dog. Hey, Governor, it's good to see you again. First of all, I want to know how you stay fit and slim in this job. It's as stressful as it is, but you can talk about that another time, perhaps. What do you see? You've been at this a while. You know Arkansas probably better than any person in government right now. What do you see as our biggest challenges for expanding prosperity for Arkansans, short-term and long-term?
Expanding prosperity. Well, obviously, lifting restrictions on restaurants and getting our hospitality industry and tourism back in full swing is the #1 priority. It's going to take getting this pandemic more behind us to be fully successful there. But what worries me is that while our economy in Arkansas is so much better than California or New York or Kentucky, where they've had all of these tight economic restrictions. We are still dependent upon global commerce and the supply chain that exists nationally. And so if Detroit is not making automobiles to the same extent because of their economy being down, we're in that supply chain. If the airline industry nationally is not producing, that hurts us because we're in the supply chain. So we have an impact on our manufacturing. So I'm worried about getting the pandemic over with, but I'm also worried about a national recovery that is quicker than what it looks like it's going to be right now. So that's got to move quicker to help us in Arkansas. I am going to answer your first part of the question that I think is a very serious question, and that is, how do you stay fit as well you expressed it, or how do you survive during 7 months of a pandemic whenever you're challenged every day on leadership and on decisions and on everything else that goes on. And it's not just about me. Today I saw a nurse and I said, when's the last time you had a vacation? And she said it was in February. And the people are under stress, and I tell them, and I've told my staff, you've got to take time off. You've got to make yourself to take some time off for yourself, because this is not going to be over in the next month. And we're in this for the long haul. And I've taken the same approach myself. So I get exercise. I still play basketball. I work out. That relieves tension, and it's critically important. So all of you that look at leadership, you've got to protect yourself and your mental well-being, because whether you're fighting terrorism or whether you're fighting a pandemic, it really depends upon your own mental well-being, and you've got to protect that and those around you to make sure they're healthy and ready to go. It's been great to be with you today, Rich. Thanks for the opportunity for everybody.
Thank you, Governor, again, for sharing your experience and helping us to try to understand those a little bit better. And I'm sure we have some thought leaders that will probably lead us in the next generation from that. So thank you again very much.